Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I dismissed it. After all, it was just an old house, full of creaks and groans, the sounds of time settling in the walls. But the longer I stayed here, the more those sounds felt wrong. It started innocently enough. The house was exactly what I had been looking for, secluded, quiet, and isolated, tucked away from the chaotic buzz of the city. I'd needed space, some time alone to sort through my life, to clear my head. The place had charm, at least in the beginning. It was old, with wooden floors that seemed to sigh under the weight of each step I took, and rooms that felt too big, too empty. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood lingered in every corner. I moved in 3 days ago. The first night was peaceful enough. I unpacked my things, adjusted to the silence, and tried to settle into the rhythm of the house. It was nothing special, just the usual sounds of an old building, the wind tapping against the window, the distant rumble of the refrigerator, the creaking of the floorboards. But then the sounds started. At first, it was just a whisper, a quiet rustling noise that came from the hallway, like someone dragging their feet across the wooden floor. I stood still, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. It continued, a steady drag, as if someone or something was pacing just outside my door. I told myself it was the house settling, maybe a loose floorboard. But the noise, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't the wind or a creaky old house. It felt like it was meant for me to hear. I was alone, I reminded myself. Just me in this empty house. But then the next night it changed. The rustling turned into something else. Something wrong. I woke up in the middle of the night, the sound pulling me from my sleep. At first, I thought I had imagined it, until I heard it again. A faint, distant sound. A voice. A laugh. It was hard to tell, but it definitely wasn't the wind. It was coming from upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen beneath the covers. Was I hearing things? I tried to convince myself it was just the house, just my mind playing tricks on me, but there was a nagging doubt that I couldn't ignore. The house felt different now. Darker, more oppressive. The next morning I took a deep breath, determined to push the fear aside. It was just nerves, right? Nothing more. But that afternoon, I went to the kitchen to make some tea, and I heard it again. This time it wasn't faint. It was louder, more distinct. It was unmistakable. The sound of a child's laughter. Or was it crying? I couldn't tell. It echoed down the hall, bouncing off the walls of the empty house, filling every inch of space. The noise was disorienting, shifting, warping. Sometimes it sounded like laughter, high-pitched and innocent, and other times it sounded like crying, desperate and broken. It didn't make sense. I was alone. I went to the door, half expecting to see something or someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. I tried to rationalize it. The house was old, full of pipes and electrical wiring. Maybe there was something in the walls causing strange noises. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. And then the sound came again. Louder this time, sharper. It was like someone was right behind me, whispering my name, but no one was there. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The house had fallen silent again. But the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. The unease had taken root, spreading through every corner of the house, every room I entered. No matter where I went, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the sounds followed me. I knew something was wrong. But what? What was causing this? Was I losing my mind? Or was there something in this house? Something alive. I didn't want to find out. But I couldn't leave. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the noises. It was the air itself, thick with tension, pressing against my skin. I felt it on the back of my neck, the sensation of eyes boring into me, following my every move. And then as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the noises came again, closer this time. Right outside the door. I couldn't breathe. The sound was unmistakable now, footsteps. Slow, heavy, dragging across the floor, coming toward me. I wanted to scream, but the air had been stolen from my lungs. I couldn't move. I felt the walls closing in. The house had turned into a prison. And I knew deep down that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Was this the house playing tricks on me? Or was something else here with me? Something that had always been here. My head spun as I reached for the doorknob, my pulse pounding in my ears. But before I could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. The sound was the last thing I heard before the world went black. When I woke up, the world felt wrong. The darkness had thickened, pressing in on me, and the air was damp, cold. For a moment I thought I was still in bed, tangled in sheets, but I quickly realized I was. I wasn't even in my room anymore. I was lying on a hard wooden floor, my head throbbing, as if I'd been knocked unconscious. The last thing I remembered was the door creaking open, then nothing. Panic rose within me as I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. I had no idea where I was. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The house, once so familiar, now felt like a stranger. The faint smell of mildew clung to the air, mixing with something else, something metallic. Blood. No, it wasn't that sharp. It was something older. Something stale. I glanced around. The room was small, much smaller than any of the others. The walls were cracked, peeling paint hanging in long strips. The floorboards creaked as I shifted, and the room seemed to groan with the weight of years. But there was something more in that groaning, something layered underneath. It was as if the house itself was whispering, murmuring in a language I didn't understand. Then I heard it. A soft sound, faint but undeniable. A laugh, a child's laugh. It was distant at first, but it echoed through the walls. I froze. It was impossible. I was alone. There was no child here. But the laugh, it was so real. so vivid. I scrambled to my feet, my body unsteady, my legs weak. My pulse raced as I moved toward the door. The floor creaked with each step I took, the sound feeling much too loud in the suffocating silence. The hallway outside was as dark as the room I had woken up in. I reached for the light switch, but there was nothing, no power, no illumination. It was as if the house had swallowed everything, including the light. I stepped into the hallway, my feet heavy, as if the air itself was pulling me down. I walked slowly, afraid that any sudden movement would set off the noise again, but I had to know what was causing it. That laugh, it was getting closer. The sound seemed to bounce off the walls, growing louder with each passing second, but when I stopped, it stopped too. Silence, absolute silence. I was alone. I told myself again. Just the house and me. But the silence felt unnatural. It pressed against me, thick like a weight on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I couldn't take it anymore. Hello, my voice cracked, the word barely escaping my dry throat. Nothing, just the hum of silence. And then the faintest sound. A shuffle, a drag, like someone or something was crawling just beyond the corner. It was close, so close. I stepped forward, each step hesitant, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. My hand trembled as it reached for the door frame, the wood rough under my fingertips. Another shuffle. Then the unmistakable sound of a whisper. It was coming from the next room. I knew it. I could feel it in the air, like the house was holding its breath. I couldn't turn back. Not now. I had to know. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, almost pitch black, but the shadows inside were different. They didn't seem right. They seemed to move like liquid, like they were alive. I stepped inside, the air colder now, the hairs on my arms standing up. My breath fogged in front of me. That laugh, it came again, this time right behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. Nothing, just shadows. It was too much. I had to get out. I couldn't stand this any longer. The laughter, the whispers, the feeling that something unseen was in the room with me, something that had always been there, something that had been waiting. I bolted for the door, but the hallway wasn't the same. The walls seemed to shift, bending and warping around me. The floorboards creaked and groaned like the house was alive and aware of me. I couldn't escape. Something gripped my ankle. I yelped, stumbling, and looked down. There was nothing there, but I felt it, something pulling me, dragging me backward into the shadows. I twisted and jerked free, my breath ragged. The laugh came again, louder now, louder than it had ever been. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound was everywhere. It was inside me, echoing through my mind, spinning into a whirlwind of madness. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear anything but that laugh, that voice. I felt dizzy, my body giving way to the terror coursing through me. But then it stopped. For a moment I thought it was over. The house was quiet again, and my own shaky breath was the only thing I could hear. I stepped back, trying to regain my balance, my mind reeling. But then I saw it. A figure in the doorway. A shadow tall and thin, standing motionless. Its features were indistinct, but I could feel it staring at me, watching me. In that laugh, it was coming from the figure now. Coming from it. It was closer, and I realized something. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I couldn't move. My body froze, pinned by the weight of that laugh. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong to this house or to this moment, and yet it was there, vibrating through the air, resonating in the walls, in my bones. The figure in the doorway didn't shift, but it felt like it was getting closer every second. The shadows around it rippled like smoke, as if they were made of something less solid. It was tall, too thin, with an unnatural bend in its posture. The edges of its shape were indistinct, as if it were only half there, flickering in and out of existence. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt as though they were glued to the floor, refusing to obey. The whispering started again. It wasn't words, it was something worse, a guttural sound that curled in my ears, like the hiss of 1,000 voices murmuring in unison, overlapping, indistinguishable from one another. "Make it stop," I whispered, barely hearing my own voice over the cacophony in my head. And then in the stillness that followed, I heard it again. The laugh. It was too real. Too close. I could feel the breath of it, cold and damp, on my neck. The shadow in the doorway remained still, but its presence seemed to expand, swallowing the room around me. Who are you?" I choked out, my voice trembling, weak. For a moment there was nothing. Just silence. Then that laugh again, this time a low chuckle that echoed in my chest. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost as if it were considering my question. And then, as if in response, a low groan rumbled from deep within the floor. It was the house again, but this time the groan was not the familiar creak of old wood. It was a warning. It was the sound of something unnatural shifting in the foundation. The air turned colder, colder than it should be, colder than it had ever been inside this house. I could see my breath, thick and white in the dim light, swirling in the frozen air. And then it moved. The figure in the doorway didn't walk. It didn't need to. It floated, drifting slowly across the room with an unnatural grace, the shadows stretching and twisting around it like something alive. The distance between us closed in an instant, and I wanted to scream, to do anything, but my mouth was dry, my throat tight, as if the very air itself had been taken from me. The figure came closer. It didn't need to make a sound. The silence between us stretched long, so long that I thought my heart might stop beating altogether. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. The floor beneath me felt like it was shifting, like it was sinking. Suddenly I felt something cold against my wrist. "Well, touch." I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. My pulse raced. The figure's laugh returned, sharp and mocking now. My head throbbed with each passing second. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask, my voice raw. I hated how small I sounded. The figure stopped in front of me, just out of arm's reach, its outline flickering like a broken television screen. There was something in the air, something thick, a presence that weighed on my chest, pushing the air out of my lungs. The shadow raised an arm. It wasn't a smooth motion, but jagged and jerky, like it was still trying to figure out how to move. I didn't move, couldn't move. The hand was long, too long, its fingers twitching as it reached for my face. My breath caught. I wanted to shut my eyes to make it go away, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me. The fingers brushed my cheek. Cold, so cold, like ice but somehow worse. It felt as though the touch seeped deep inside me, down to my core, like it was pulling something from me. I gasped, a shiver racking my entire body. The laughter stopped. For a brief moment there was quiet. It felt like everything had gone still, like time itself had stopped. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't the laugh anymore. It was a whisper. You shouldn't have stayed. The words were so soft, so faint, but they echoed through me, reverberating in my skull. I tried to speak, but no words came. My throat was tight, the fear choking me, drowning me. My eyes were locked onto the figure, now standing directly in front of me, its face still hidden in shadow, but its presence overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, and then suddenly, everything was loud. A crashing like thunder, shaking the walls, and the floor beneath my feet buckled. I stumbled, catching myself on the door frame. I had to get out. I had to get away from this. I turned. The door was still there, just behind me. But the hallway was different. It wasn't the same hallway I had seen before. The walls seemed to pulse, to shift with each beat of my heart. The air was thick with something I couldn't name. I started to run. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get out. But the house seemed to stretch and warp around me, the hallways growing longer, twisting like a maze. The sound of my footsteps was muffled, as if the very foundation was trying to silence me. And then above all the noise, above the echoes of my panic and the thrumming in my head, I heard it again. The laugh, it was everywhere, and I knew then that I wasn't running fast enough. I could feel the house shifting around me, the walls groaning and creaking like they were alive, bending to the will of something far darker than simple wood and stone. Every step I took echoed louder than the last, but the sound didn't seem to travel. It bounced back at me from every direction, warping like 1,000 whispers, pressing in on my mind, each one a different voice calling my name, or worse, mocking me. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was raw, a dull ache in my chest like I was being suffocated by the very air itself. The hallway stretched out in front of me, but it was no longer the same hallway. The familiar walls now seemed to loom taller, the ceilings low and oppressive, like they were closing in. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, as though I was walking on shifting sand. My head spun, my senses betrayed me. The house wasn't right, it wasn't real anymore. I turned a corner, desperation making me move faster, but I wasn't sure where I was going. I wasn't even sure if I was still in the house anymore. I was lost in a maze of impossible angles, rooms that never ended, hallways that looped back in on themselves. And the sound was everywhere. The laugh, it wasn't a mere echo anymore. It wasn't something distant. It was inside me. A tickling, crawling sensation, like it was gnawing on the edges of my thoughts, turning them dark. Each time it burst out, that laugh, it felt like something was unraveling inside me, like my mind was losing its grip on reality. The air was thick. It pressed on me as if the walls themselves were watching me. The faintest sound of movement reached my ears, a shift in the air. A brush of something cold against my neck, just behind me, making every muscle in my body tense. My skin crawled. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I kept moving, my steps now shaky, unsteady. The sound of my feet hitting the floor felt too loud, too urgent. My heartbeat pounded in my chest, drowning out everything else. Was it getting louder? The laughter, the whispers, or was I just losing it? Was I finally going mad? Focus, I told myself, but my voice came out weak, barely audible against the deafening silence that followed. I couldn't focus. I couldn't even remember the last time I had stopped to breathe. The hallway finally split into two directions, but neither felt like an option. Left or right, neither made sense. Neither promised safety. I stood there, staring at the two paths in front of me, frozen. The silence was so thick it pressed against my chest. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. They were numb. The sound of my breathing was the only thing that seemed real in the crushing silence. And then a soft thump. It was distant, but it cut through the silence with such clarity that I felt it in my bones. A heartbeat, a footstep. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned right, running without thinking, blindly, through a hallway that seemed to stretch on endlessly. My hands were shaking, my breath shallow. Each corner I turned felt like a dead end, every step more frantic than the last. The sound of that heartbeat, no, those footsteps, grew closer. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was following me. The walls around me pulsed. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath again, sharp and white in the dim light. I stumbled, a sharp pain shooting through my ankle as I tripped over something on the floor. But there was no time to pause, no time to think. I had to keep moving. I pushed myself up, pain shooting through my body, but it didn't matter. The footsteps behind me were closer now, faster. Who was it? What was it? And then the door. It appeared out of nowhere, the wood so dark it almost seemed like a hole in the world, beckoning me forward. A way out. A way to escape. I ran toward it. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't know. The door slammed shut just as I reached it, locking with a sickening click. The sound was final, the click ringing in my ears. I backed away, my heart racing. No. I was trapped. The room around me felt smaller, the walls closing in like a vice. My mind reeled as I turned to look around. There were no windows, no escape, only darkness stretching farther than it should. And then the laughter. It came from everywhere. Behind me, in front of me, overhead, underneath me. It was deafening, reverberating inside my skull, driving me mad. I could feel it inside my chest, rattling my bones. The shadow in the corner moved. Slowly at first, but then it twisted, contorting in a way that no human being could, stretching impossibly thin, crawling toward me. No, I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of that laugh, too loud to bear, too real to ignore. I reached for the door handle. It was locked. I heard a voice then. A whisper. You should have left. The room grew darker still, the shadows in the corners creeping closer. The door began to pulse rhythmically like it was alive. Something behind it shifted, growing bigger, taking form. The figure had found me. The figure loomed larger, its shape bending in ways that didn't make sense. I could hear it moving behind the door, its weight shifting, dragging against the wood with a sound that felt like nails scraping on a chalkboard. My hand was still on the handle, but it was useless. The door was no longer solid. It felt soft, almost like it was melting under my touch, warping and bending with every heartbeat that thudded painfully in my chest. The laughter, it wasn't just a laugh anymore. It had become something worse. A sound that wasn't human, a distorted screech that seemed to claw its way out of the very walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, from inside my head. I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned to face the room. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were things moving, slithering along the walls like liquid darkness, reaching for me. They shifted, pulsed, and reached out, as though the room itself was alive, alive in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the house was breathing, every inhale filling the air with something cold, something rotten. The shadows crept toward me, their forms flickering like the last embers of a fire. Something or someone was in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, but I knew it was there. The presence was palpable. A weight in the air, like something pressing against my very soul. I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I whispered, the words scraping out of my dry throat. My voice, fragile and thin, barely reached above the deafening sound of my own pulse. But there was no answer. Just the quiet that followed the scream of silence. My eyes darted across the room, trying to find something, anything, to make sense of it. But everything was wrong. The walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The floor cracked and shifted beneath me, groaning as though the entire house was going to collapse. Every step I took, every movement I made, seemed to amplify the sound. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They had grown taller, twisting into unnatural forms that seemed to loom in every corner of my vision, waiting. I reached for the first thing I could find, a broken chair leg, and held it up like a weapon. It was a pathetic attempt at defense, but it was all I had. My heart was pounding in my ears. My breath shallow and fast. Every inch of me screamed to run, but where could I go? There was nowhere left to hide. The laugh came again, but this time it wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling deep in my gut, a coldness that spread throughout my body. The laughter was becoming something else, a force of its own, a thing that didn't just fill the room, it filled my mind. Every thought, every sense was overwhelmed by it. Suddenly the shadows lunged. They seemed to leap at me from all directions, swirling, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket of darkness. I screamed and swung the chair leg wildly, but it passed right through the shadows, as if they weren't even real. They didn't have a form to strike. I stumbled backward, crashing into something hard. It wasn't the wall, though. It was cold and metallic, the window. I spun around in a panic, pushing against it, my breath fogging up the glass. It was locked. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the house wasn't letting me. It wasn't going to let me go. The shadows were closing in, encircling me, their whispers now loud enough that I could almost understand them. The voices, they weren't just laughter anymore. They were words, fragments of sentences that didn't quite make sense, twisted and broken. Your mind, we see you, you can't leave. The temperature dropped again, the air turning icy. I could see my breath now, each exhale a sharp burst of vapor in the cold. The darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating me, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the walls themselves were folding over, closing in, sealing me inside. Suddenly there was a shift. The shadows pulled back for a moment, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something. Something that shouldn't have been there. A figure. It was tall, too tall, its body stretching impossibly thin, like it was made of smoke or ash. It was almost a silhouette, but not quite, as if its form was constantly shifting, flickering in and out of existence. The figure's face, if it could be called a face, was a blur of darkness, a patch of nothingness that seemed to stare right through me. There was no mouth, no eyes, but I could feel it watching me. The laughter stopped. For a moment the world was silent. The figure loomed before me, a presence I couldn't escape, a shadow that reached into the very core of my being. The air was thick, suffocating. And then in that silence I heard it, the voice. It didn't come from the figure, but from the walls, the floor, the very room itself. You shouldn't have stayed. I tried to move, to scream, but my body was frozen. The shadows tightened their grip, pulling me toward the figure. I couldn't fight. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness consumed me. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. It started with a question. What if you're not alone, even when you think you are? I didn't expect anything to change when I moved into this apartment. It was a cheap place, old and worn, but perfect for someone who didn't mind the quiet and isolation. I needed somewhere to recover, to escape from the past. The landlord had said it had been empty for years, which didn't bother me. I liked the idea of living in a forgotten space where no one would look twice at me. Just a place to sleep and then disappear into my thoughts. But then there it was. The journal. It was tucked behind a stack of old books in a dusty corner of the closet. I was sorting through the apartment when I found it, the brown leather cover almost blending into the shadows. At first I thought nothing of it, just another forgotten thing left behind by the previous tenant. But when I flipped it open, I froze. The first page was blank. The next too. But then there it was. The writing. It wasn't mine. The sounds in this place are too much to ignore. I hear them every night getting closer. The walls seem to move. Or maybe it's me. My hand trembled as I turned the page. The handwriting was neat, almost precise, but there was something unsettling about the way the words bled into each other, like the ink was bleeding with the writer's fear. I hear footsteps. No one is here. There's no one. But the steps are there and they're getting louder. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming too quickly. I tried to shake it off. It was just a story, I told myself. The ramblings of a lonely mind. But the words stuck. The air in the apartment felt different after that. It was heavier, almost suffocating, like something was watching. I laughed it off, convinced it was my own mind playing tricks. I hadn't been sleeping well. My thoughts were darker lately. But then, as I tried to settle into bed that night, the silence crept in again. It was too quiet. That constant stillness in the apartment, broken only by the creaks of old wood shifting under my weight. But tonight it wasn't just the house shifting. No, it was more. It felt alive. I lay there trying to ignore the rising sense of panic. But the longer I lay in the dark, the more I began to hear it. The soft sound of something moving, shuffling, scratching. I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my head into the pillow. It's nothing, I thought. But then the sound grew louder. It wasn't just a scratch. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor. They were coming closer. My heart thudded against my chest as the steps grew louder, more pronounced. Each step felt heavier. The floor beneath me seemed to hum with the vibrations of them. I could hear them so close now. They were right outside my door. I couldn't move. The seconds stretched on one after another until the silence hit again. But this time it wasn't the peaceful quiet I had grown used to. It was something else. A tension that filled the room, thick and suffocating. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly pulled myself up, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind or the house settling. But then from the corner of my eye, I saw something that stopped me cold. A shadow. It was small at first, nothing more than a fleeting movement near the edge of the room. I blinked, thinking it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But then it moved. It shifted, a darker shape, pulling itself across the wall. I jumped to my feet, panic setting in. The air in the room was colder now, colder than it should be. I glanced back at the journal, still lying on the table where I had left it. The last entry, scrawled messily, burned itself into my mind. The shadow follows me. I can't escape it. It's everywhere. It's in the walls. It's in the air. I froze, and then I heard it again. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. My name. It was a soft sound, but so clear, so familiar. James. I felt my blood run cold. I turned slowly, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Yet that feeling, that presence, lingered. A shiver ran down my spine. I reached for the light switch, desperate to push back the darkness. But as I flipped the switch, the room remained dim. Something was wrong. I should have been able to see clearly. But the shadows didn't move like they should have. They were alive, shifting against the walls, curling like smoke. I backed away, breathing fast. The journal. I needed to know more. Maybe it had answers. But the thought of opening it again, of seeing those words that had already started to creep into my mind, unsettled me. Still, I couldn't help it. My hands trembled as I picked it up, flipping through the pages. Each entry was darker than the last. The shadow is here. I can feel it watching. Every night it gets closer. Every night it becomes clearer. I swallowed hard, staring at the final sentence, my eyes unable to leave it. I think I've seen it. I think it's me. I slammed the book shut. But it didn't help. The fear had already taken root. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming closer. That thing. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers kept coming, like a faint hum in the distance that refused to fade. I lay wide awake, eyes glued to the ceiling, watching as shadows shifted in the corners of the room. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder, each second stretching longer than the last. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the presence waiting, watching. The room had become a different place since I found that journal. No longer a refuge, no longer a sanctuary from my thoughts. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind that rattled the windows made my heart race. I couldn't help but feel that someone was out there, just beyond the edge of my sight, just out of reach. The next morning, I didn't want to face it. I tried to shake off the feeling, tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, a product of stress or exhaustion. But I couldn't. The atmosphere in the apartment was too thick, too heavy. It pressed in on me from all sides, wrapping around my chest like a vice. I went to the kitchen, hoping the simple act of making coffee would clear my mind. But as soon as I stepped into the small, dimly lit room, I felt it again, the chill in the air, the pressure building around me. I turned to the counter, and there, lying in the middle of the surface, was the journal. I hadn't left it there. I distinctly remembered placing it on the table last night, just beside the bed. Panic clawed at my throat as I reached for it, flipping through the pages. The entries, each more frantic than the last, stared back at me. I could feel the fear in the ink. The desperation. Oh, it's here. The words seemed to vibrate in my skull. I dropped the journal, my breath shallow, panic surging through me. The room was too still. The silence had become unbearable. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been outside. Had it been days? Weeks? I couldn't tell anymore. Time had become something I couldn't grasp. It had become fluid, like the shadows in my apartment, slipping away whenever I tried to pin them down. The whispering grew louder, clearer, as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. The faintest hint of a voice, my name again. James, I whipped around, heart hammering. But the room was empty. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, barely thinking. The cold air outside was a slap to my senses, but even the streets seemed unfamiliar. The houses on the block looked different now, somehow. The colors were muted, the shadows longer. The trees seemed to stretch out toward me like twisted fingers. I forced myself to keep walking, but the whispers followed me. I tried to block them out, tried to focus on the world around me, but it felt as though the very air was thick with them. As though something or someone was always just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. And then in a flash, the thought struck me, what if it isn't real? What if I'm the one losing my mind? I stopped in the middle of the street, trying to breathe, trying to shake the feeling that everything around me was slowly dissolving into something else. Something twisted. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of a storefront window, I caught a glimpse of myself. But it wasn't me, not entirely. The face staring back was pale, gaunt. The eyes were wide and vacant, hollow like they had been drained of life. I blinked and the reflection shifted, the shadowed figure in the glass morphing into someone else. I spun around, heart pounding. There was nothing there. My hand went to my mouth, stifling the scream that threatened to break free. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the pavement as I lost my balance. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. James, it wasn't in my head. I could feel it now, as though the very air itself was alive with voices. My chest tightened as I backed away from the window, trying to escape it, but the voice followed me, growing more insistent. It was like the world was closing in on me. I had to get back to the apartment. I had to figure out what was happening, what was in that journal, because something wasn't right. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. I wasn't just hearing things. The journal, it was alive somehow. The words in it, they weren't just memories, they were something else. Something that had been waiting for me. I rushed back, but as I neared the apartment, I hesitated. I stopped outside the building, staring up at the old, decaying structure. The windows seemed darker than they should have been. The air had a strange, oppressive weight to it. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The door creaked open with a soft groan as I stepped inside, and the temperature dropped immediately. I made my way back to my apartment, but the hallway seemed longer now, the shadows stretching farther, twisting into unnatural shapes. I could hear the sound of something scraping against the floor, just ahead of me, like fingernails dragged across wood. I reached my door and froze. The shadows in the hallway, no, they weren't shadows anymore. There were shapes moving, shifting, growing. I could feel them pressing against me, pushing me toward the door. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open. And there it was. The journal. Open. The pages were turning slowly, as if being flipped by an invisible hand. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The walls seemed to close in around me. The whispers were louder now, like they were coming from all directions. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the journal and threw it across the room, watching as it landed with a thud on the floor. And then the room went still. Too still. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. The whispers faded, but something else remained. A presence. Something watching. I could feel it just behind me. Slowly I turned around, but no one was there. Only the shadows moving. I didn't stay long. The door slammed shut behind me as I ran out of the apartment, the journal forgotten on the floor. But I knew deep down it wasn't over. Whatever it was still following me. And it always would. I didn't stop running until I reached the park at the edge of the neighborhood. The world around me seemed distant, muffled, like I was moving through a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. I didn't care about the cold, the fog rolling in, or the way the trees twisted in the dim light. I just had to keep moving, keep running. My legs were heavy, my breath sharp in the cold night air, but I couldn't stop. It felt as if something were gaining on me, though I couldn't say exactly what. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing in my skull. The world felt lost. Everything felt wrong. I found a bench and collapsed onto it, my hands trembling as I ran them through my hair. The park was deserted, the trees stripped bare, their limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. The distant lights of the city flickered through the mist, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and terror. I needed answers. I needed to know why this was happening. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. That damn journal. My mind kept returning to it, to those entries that weren't mine, that somehow spoke to me. Each word seemed to seep into my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the mess I was already drowning in. I had to go back. I had to know what it all meant. But a small voice deep inside me, warned me not to. I stood up from the bench, trembling, my eyes darting around the park, scanning the shadows. Was it just my mind playing tricks, or was something out there? The whispers were gone, but the silence had taken their place. A heavy, oppressive silence that pressed in on me from all sides. My hand instinctively reached into my jacket pocket, feeling the cold, smooth surface of my phone. I unlocked it, hands still shaking, and stared at the screen. There were no missed calls, no messages, nothing. I hadn't been in contact with anyone. Not in days. The time on the phone was wrong. It was hours later than I remembered, but the world around me hadn't changed. It didn't make sense. I stood there for a moment, staring at the clock, before the strange feeling returned, like I was being watched. I spun around, but the park was empty. The fog had thickened, the trees now nothing but dark, shapeless forms against the sky. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was then that I heard it again. The whispering. But this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the trees, the mist, and the thickening shadows. The whispering seemed to swirl around me, and it took me a moment to realize it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many voices overlapping, blending together into an indistinguishable hum. They were coming from everywhere, from the trees, from the ground beneath my feet, from inside my own head. James, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, as if someone was standing right next to me, breathing down my neck. I couldn't breathe. I staggered backward, my mind a fog of panic. It felt like I was suffocating, like the air had become too thick to breathe, and the whispers, the voices, were closing in around me. I had to leave. I turned and ran again, my legs moving on their own, carrying me away from the park, away from whatever this was. My mind screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. The fear was too strong. My thoughts raced with questions I didn't have the answers to. I reached my apartment building again. How? How had I gotten back here? I couldn't remember. It was as if time had collapsed in on itself. I looked up at the building. The shadows that clung to it now seemed darker, thicker than they had been before. The windows looked like eyes watching me. I entered the building as quickly as I could, but the whispers followed me, echoing in my ears. I couldn't escape them. I reached my door, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so violently that it took me several attempts before I finally managed to unlock it. As soon as the door creaked open, I bolted inside, slamming it shut behind me. The silence in the apartment was deafening. But something was different. The air felt colder, much colder than it had before, and the shadows in the corners of the room had grown darker, more substantial. The apartment, once so familiar, now felt like a foreign place. It had changed, I had changed. I could feel it. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing, shifting as if they were alive. The journal was still there. It sat on the table where I had left it before. The pages were still open, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't want to go near it, but the pull was irresistible. My hands moved on their own, reaching for it, pulling it toward me. The pages fluttered under my fingertips, almost like they were alive. I couldn't help myself. I had to read more. It's coming. The words sent a chill down my spine. I scanned the rest of the page, but there was nothing else. Just that one sentence, written in shaky, frantic handwriting. The page before that was blank, but something about the blankness unsettled me more than anything. I turned the page. The shadow is here. I see it in the corner of the room. It watches me. It waits. I gasped, dropping the journal in horror. The words on the page were too familiar. The fear, the panic, the sense of being watched, it was the same feeling I had experienced, the same words that had echoed in my mind. I was losing my grip on reality. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay here any longer. I rushed to the door, but before I could open it, the whispering returned, louder, more insistent. It was inside the room now, swirling around me, filling my ears, my head. The walls trembled and the shadows moved, slithering across the room like dark, living things. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere left to run. I turned back to the journal, my eyes wide with terror. The final entry, something that wasn't there before, had appeared. It's me. I am the shadow. It was always me. The words seemed to burn themselves into my mind. I was no longer sure if I was even myself anymore. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath, but the air was gone. The world had already slipped away. I couldn't breathe. The air had turned thick, heavy, suffocating, like I was drowning in it. My chest felt as though it was being crushed under the weight of something unseen. I tried to move, tried to tear my eyes away from the journal, but the words, their meaning, held me in place. It's me. I am the shadow. It was always me. The sentence repeated itself in my mind over and over, as if mocking me. My hands trembled uncontrollably, the journal lying in front of me like some cursed artifact, its pages now blank again, as though the ink had never existed. But I knew. I could feel it. The words were still there, etched into my skull. I stumbled backward, hands pressed against my face, trying to block it out. The walls seemed to stretch away from me, the space around me warping and twisting. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more defined, and the room, my apartment, no longer felt like the place I had been living for weeks. It felt foreign, threatening. I was losing control. The whispers, once soft and distant, now became a cacophony of voices, swirling around me like a storm. I could hear them clearly now. Words, fragments of sentences, murmurs too low to make sense of, but they were unmistakable. James, It's always been you. Come to us, James. You've always known. The air grew colder still until I could see my breath in front of me. The shadows in the corners of the room were no longer shadows. They were shapes, figures moving slowly, gathering together like dark clouds, drawing closer to me with every breath. I looked around in desperation. The door. I needed to get out. I had to escape, but my legs refused to move. They were rooted to the floor, my body locked in place by something far stronger than fear. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, raw, as if someone had reached inside me and was choking the life out of me. I reached out for the walls, grasping at them for support, but they felt slippery, as though they were made of water instead of brick. Well, James. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was no one. The room was empty, save for the growing shadows. My reflection, if it could be called that, was distorted in the window, my face pale and gaunt, eyes hollowed out. I could hear my own voice now, mingling with the others. Oh, it's me. I am the shadow. The words bled into one another, as though the boundaries between them were breaking down. I stumbled forward, reaching for the door again, but my hands weren't my own anymore. They were cold, stiff, like the hands of a stranger. They seemed to move of their own accord, pulling me toward the center of the room. James, I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. The shadows had already surrounded me, their tendrils creeping along the floor, curling up around my ankles, pulling me down. The air was thick now, saturated with something foul, like rotting earth. The whispers grew louder, sharper, as if the walls themselves were screaming at me. I had to get out. I needed to get out. I screamed, finally finding my voice, but it was swallowed by the shadows, devoured by the empty space around me. My hands shook violently as I reached for the door, my fingers slipping off the handle like it was coated in grease. Something shifted behind me. I turned slowly, dread coiling around my spine like a snake. The shadows in the room had taken on a new shape, a figure, tall and formless, standing motionless in the corner of the room. It was there, but not there. It was more than a shadow. It was an absence, a void. It's time. The voice was like sandpaper scraping across my mind. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, vibrating in the very air in my bones. It filled every corner of the room, every space in my mind. The figure stepped forward, and though it had no face, I could feel its eyes, watching. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. I felt as though I was sinking into the floor, as though my body was dissolving into the darkness around me. It's always been you, James. The voice was all around me now, seeping into my skin, into my thoughts. I could feel it like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. The figure came closer, the edges of its form shifting, pulsing, like it was being shaped out of the very darkness itself. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was a thing from the spaces between spaces, from the places where light never reaches. And yet it was so familiar. I knew this thing. I've been with you all along. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The figure's presence was suffocating, drowning out everything else. I could feel its influence over me, its grip tightening, pulling me toward it, toward that black void where nothing had form. I realized then it was me. I wasn't running from it. I had been running from myself. The shadow wasn't a thing outside of me. It was inside me, a part of me that had always been there, waiting. And now it had come to claim me. I reached out to the journal which lay on the floor open. The words had appeared again, written in the same frantic, desperate script. It's me. I am the shadow. The journal had been right all along. I had never been running from something that wasn't me. I had been running from myself. And now it was too late. The darkness closed in around me, swallowing everything. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the whisper, faint but certain. It's over, James. Then there was nothing. I woke up, but I didn't know where I was. The air around me was still, thick with a suffocating quiet that pressed in on my senses. My eyes fluttered open, but the world was too blurry to make sense of. My head pounded like a drum, and every muscle in my body ached, as if I had been dragged through an endless, bruising nightmare. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. For a moment I thought I might still be dreaming. But the cold against my skin, the rough texture beneath me, it felt all too real. My breathing was shallow, erratic, and when I finally managed to focus my vision, I saw that I was lying on the floor of my apartment. But everything had changed. The walls were no longer familiar. The furniture, the decorations, everything was twisted, altered. The shapes were wrong, like some grotesque parody of the place I had once known. The shadows clung to every corner, darker and deeper than they had ever been, as if they were alive, watching me, waiting. And there it was, the journal. It lay on the table in front of me, untouched, yet somehow beckoning. The same pages, the same haunting words. I tried to ignore it, but the pull was undeniable. My hand reached out on its own, trembling, desperate to turn the pages once again. It's me. I am the shadow. I stared at the words, the meaning of them finally sinking into my mind with a terrible clarity. The shadow was me, and I had become it. A wave of panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my legs unsteady, my thoughts a jumbled mess of terror. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air too thick, too heavy to breathe. The whispers started again, soft at first, like a distant hum, but growing louder with every passing second. They surrounded me, filled every inch of the space, and I couldn't escape them. James. The voice was clear now, undeniable. It wasn't in my head anymore. It was real. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, no presence. Just the oppressive darkness in every corner of the room, growing deeper with every breath I took. James, you know it's true. You've always known. The voice was so close now. So close I could feel it vibrating in my bones, a soundless hum that rattled me to my core. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the walls, the shadows, or from within myself. But I knew it was there. And then I saw it. The figure. It wasn't standing in the corner anymore. It was everywhere, a dark shape that seemed to stretch and bend with the shadows, flowing and shifting like liquid blackness. Its presence enveloped me, and I felt myself being pulled into it, consumed by it. The air around me grew colder, colder than it had ever been, until I could feel the frost creeping into my bones. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My voice was swallowed by the darkness like everything else. It was always you, James. The figure moved closer, its form twisting, turning, until it was right in front of me. But it had no face, no features. It was only a silhouette, a dark void that consumed everything around it. And yet I knew it. I knew it as well as I knew myself. It was me. I backed away, desperate to escape, but my body no longer obeyed me. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unmovable. The shadows were pulling me down, dragging me toward the figure, and I couldn't stop it. You're mine now. The voice was louder than ever, the words shaking me to my very core. I felt my heart thudding in my chest, my blood rushing through my veins like a storm. I reached out, my hands grasping at the air, but there was nothing there. Just the cold, the darkness, the endless weight of it all. It's over. The words echoed in my mind, and then suddenly everything went quiet. The world around me disappeared. The shadows receded, the weight lifted, and the air cleared. I was alone. I opened my eyes, blinking, trying to understand what had just happened. For a moment there was nothing. No whispers, no figure, just silence. I was back in my apartment, but something had changed. The walls were still the same, the furniture was still in place. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. The journal. It was gone. I searched frantically, tearing through the apartment, throwing things aside, looking in every corner. But it was nowhere to be found. The journal that had once been the source of my terror, the thing that had dragged me into this nightmare, was no longer there. And then in the stillness, I realized the truth. I was the one who had written it. It had never been a curse. It had never been some external force pulling me into darkness. The darkness had always been inside me. It was me. It was my fear, my guilt, my own shadow. And now I had nowhere to run. Because I was the shadow. I stood there in the empty apartment, staring at the spot where the journal had once been. The silence was deafening, and yet I could hear it. The whispering. It's not over, James. It's never over. The shadows shifted around me, and I knew. It would never end. Not for me. Not for anyone. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.